All right, well, thanks everyone for coming down. Can you hear me okay? All good? Perfect. Look, today's presentation is going to be on funding. Now, you can tell we're accountants. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the name of our presentation, and that was the best we came up with. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more entertaining than that, and we'll be able to cover off some concepts today, really about sort of trying to bring together some of the various other talks that you'll see across GCAP, as well as information online, and talk about this idea of sustainability in studios and how we can sort of bring together the various offerings to create an opportunity for people to exist beyond one title. So, without further ado, I think we skipped the disclaimer. Everyone's aware of that. Read that quickly. So when we talk about a sustainable studio, what are we talking about here? It's really about this sort of idea of advancing beyond a singular title. So often when a studio comes across to us, Amy and myself, from LDB, did introduce yourself, we are often dealing with them from a perspective of you've got a great idea, how do we go and commercialise this, and where do we sort of get off the ground? And oftentimes that's sort of the very entry-level point for the conversation. It very quickly turns to, well, what does the future look like? And the future really is about a series of releases and ongoing work for a team that creates long-term continuity and employment. So when we talk about, and today what we're going to talk about is a singular title, but really these concepts apply across the board and just become more complex as you get into multiple title studios and people transitioning between different titles over time. So in our view, success really is defined by managing your cash flow and dealing with the money in and the money out. And that's ultimately where a lot of this sort of challenges for studios come into play, is the challenge of funding the cost of development before you're actually seeing anything come out on the revenue side of things. So there's ultimately over the medium term, continuity becomes by virtue of the fact that you're relying on the revenue of the previous release. And for many of the successful studios, it's a series of releases or the ability to adapt and advance an existing title to create an ongoing stream of funds. Typically, because of the nature of the release cycle, money's coming in bursts, so that doesn't necessarily match with the flow of outgoings. And if you're employing people, you've got sort of an ongoing contribution on a monthly basis. So really what we're talking about here is ultimately creating the ability for a team to have access to capital, profitability on their project, the ability to then take that information and report it and pay tax on it, and then plan into the future and understand how they're going to have that money coming in, how they're going to expend it, and what ultimately hopefully will be left on the bottom line from a profit standpoint. So I might step across here and I'll hand over to Amy to talk about cash flow.
Yeah, so I'm going to have a bit of a chat about cash flow. So you always get the question, why do accountants care about cash flow so much? And it is an age-old question. Cash flow is super important, as Luke said, to make a sustainable studio, to make it last, and to ride those ebbs and flows, those ups and downs that you'll have over the development life cycle. So it's super important to be able to plan and manage your cash over the entire cycle. So a lot of people, the majority of cash or expenses, cash outflow, happen during their development stage. So that is usually the longest stage and the most expensive stage of the life cycle. But that's the important part, and that's where you need to manage the cash. So we like to look at cash flow. In the games industry, we usually like to look at it from the bottom-up method. So what that does is that basically looks at your expenditure. What is your basic expend? What's your constant expenditure during the entire life cycle? So we're talking about things that don't go away. We're talking about the director's salary. We're talking about the key core staff. We're talking about the contractors that you need, the animators, etc., and when you need them. So we need to look at those constants. And when you have employees, we're then looking at the constant rent, the overheads, the internet costs, that sort of thing. So we need to look at what's constant across the entire project, and we call that your burn rate. So that's what you're burning each month that your development life cycle takes. That's the amount of cash that is flowing out the door. There's obviously ad hoc expenses and overhead expenses and things like that, and we are going to go through a little bit of a model as well. There's a bit of a kind of demo, I guess. Just to explain it. But that's the overarching goal, is to know what your expenditure is and then work up to that. So, well, when do I need my revenue? When is my revenue coming in? When can I expect my funding to come in, or my investment, or my DGTO at the very end? So that's what we like to look at, or call the bottom-up method, and our burn rate, essentially. So what we'll do is we're actually going to swap across to a cash flow and just have a little bit of a look. Yeah, and then on the other side too. Okay. So we at LDB, we like to look at it at 5 particular categories for a cash flow. So we like to look at personnel costs, because they're a real bulk, essentially the bulk of the costs that you will incur. So this is a cash flow template that we like to use here. Essentially, we like to look at who do you need and when do you need them. So we're just picking a 2-year development life cycle for this, which is very optimistic, we understand that, potentially not realistic. But we really want to look at, well, when do you need your producer? Do you need it the entire time? When do you need an animator? When do you need a composer? Are they going to be an employee? Are they going to be a contractor? Do we need to include super? Do we need to have work cover and those sorts of things for it? So what we like to do is to plan it out so that it comes in a monthly cycle, essentially. So this little template that we've created essentially puts, the average rate that you'd be taking per month or per year if it's a salary for an individual, and splits it out over the months that you require that person. So it gives you a monthly spend of how much it costs the studio to employ that person, so how much you can expect. Now that's important. Oh, don't know what happened there. Now that's important to know, because as we know, the revenue is lumpy, the funding is lumpy. We need to know how much it's going to cost per month so that you can ride that wave through it.
It's important to note here, I think, we're putting this down from an employment standpoint as fixed costs for a period, and if you would like to think of it perhaps in the context of maybe fixed rate contracts or something like that, but we appreciate that in some instances maybe their employment is done on a more ongoing basis, and so maybe you need to consider on a project by project allocation.
Absolutely. We sort of like to look at the next cost, which is your occupancy costs. So that's, where are you going to put this staff? What are you going to do with them? Do you want to have an office? Are you all going to work remotely? Potentially, if your cash burn is a lot more than you think, maybe you will work remotely. Maybe you won't incur those overhead costs. So this is kind of just splitting out another one. Well, my team's going to start off at, month 3 or month 6. So I'm going to need an office. I'm going to need utilities. I'm going to need internet to pay for there. So this is our occupancy costs, or costs of housing our employees and contractors, which is essential and usually constant. Once you make that decision, you're kind of locked into it for at least 12 or 3 12, 24, 36, who knows how long your lease will be.
Depends how long a commercial lease
is.
Yeah,
how long you can get it these days. The third sort of section that we go on is just operating costs. Now, we've just filled this out with some dummy data, but obviously it will look a little bit different if you were to actually do it. So things like computers and servers and things like that, they are expensive these days, and you need to account for it. Not everyone's going to bring their own computer that's, got the right metrics for you to be able to do the development on, so you might need to provide that. Server costs, they're never-ending, monthly. They're going to be ongoing for the entire life of your game. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on.
This is a sponsor, so it's
So these are the operating costs of your studio. So things that are going to come around that you're going to incur and you can't avoid it. So planning for when they come around is really important, because you need to be able to know when that cost is coming. You need to be able to fund that cost, and that's what we're going to talk about in the latter half of this presentation. So getting a bit sort of closer to release or close to the end, you'll obviously incur some marketing and some advertising type expenditure.
Or should.
Should, potentially. So, there might be going to conferences, it might be taking your product to GDC, it might be coming here to GCAP, or it might be advertising on a store or running a promotion, etc. These are kind of a bit more one-off costs because you'll do them at a certain time in the life cycle. So you might do it right before release. You might do it before a good time in the year when you want to spike sales and get another little injection of income. And that might be an injection of income that's pivotal for your next title. So you might be relying on that income for your next title as well, which is also why cash flow is so important, not only to look at it on a project basis or a title basis, but entirely for your studio as well as a long-term sort of goal, essentially. And then the last sort of area we have is the overhead costs. So with the overhead costs, that's essentially everything else. That's the accountants, that's the lawyers, that's the cost of doing business that you can't avoid, that you need. And that could be anything, and that will come in and out. It's usually a bit more ad hoc though, or once a year or that type of thing. Generally not a monthly sort of spend. Those monthly spends will be in probably one of the other 5 categories above. So what we like about cash flows, we like to see it in a graph sort of format. So when you have some data in here, and we've got some dummy data, which will kind of show an average thing. So over a project, that is kind of how we expect the cash flow to sort of look. So we're just purely talking about cash outflow, and we'd expect it to be on the rise in the planning stages. We'd expect, things to start kicking off, but that real chunk in the middle is your dev stage. And that is a huge stage, and that is where a lot of these expenses are going to come through. And that is really where we need to understand our funding and our revenue sources, or be in the market to generate those revenue sources at that time. So once you release, and this graph is meant to sort of show the release at the tail there, they will go down, costs will go down a little bit. You'll still have staff that you need to do updates and things like that, and hopefully you'll be pivoting into another title at that time. But some of those other costs that were specific to that project might sort of drop off a little bit, so you see a sort of tail down on that one. So this is just a sort of guide as to how it sort of might look, which sort of dovetails into then, well, okay, if that's what I need to spend, then how am I going to get money during that period, and when am I going to need it, and how am I going to generate it, essentially. So we might flip back to the presentation. Top one. Second one. There we go. Okay.
So if anyone wants a copy of that spreadsheet, feel free to shoot an email through. We'll be able to circulate it. I'm not sure how we can circulate it through IGEA. We might be able to post it into the YouTube link once it comes up.
Yep.
But yeah, by all means, come up and hit us up for a copy if you'd like one.
And it can certainly be tailored as well. It's very easy to tailor yourself as well if need be. So when we're looking at it, I'll just flip to the next one. Yeah. So as I mentioned, this is kind of your basic project timeline. So you've usually got about 4 phases. Now, this doesn't always work. They're not always exactly the same, but this is kind of how we see it. 4 different sort of phases that you essentially will go through across the span of a project. So the planning phase, now again, we've used 24 months. It's a little bit optimistic potentially. But that could be anything. That could be 5 years, it could be 3 years. Whatever your actual overall project time frame is what this would represent. The proportions are sort of similar though. So the planning phase is usually a little bit smaller. That's when you get the ground off. You might have the idea, and you might have had the idea for a while, but the planning phase is really, getting the company, incorporating it, starting out, actually sort of commercialising that idea and taking it a little bit to market. Yeah, prototyping, essentially. So that's usually a smaller sort of phase of the entire timeline, if you look at it. The development phase is usually quite large, so that's usually the longest phase that you'll have in the timeline of the project, and as I mentioned, where you're going to incur the majority of your expenditure. Following that, you'll release it at a point, hopefully at a point that you've planned and at a good time. It hasn't gone too over time, but once you release, then obviously that's when the revenue from the game will start to come in, but also conversely from that, if you do have some external funding, it might be when you need to start repaying some debt potentially.
Yep.
And then after that, you post-release. So post-release could be who knows how long. That could be, if it's a really good title or AAA title, your post-release will go for a long time and you'll have a really long tail of revenue coming from that. But whatever that post-release situation is where you might go into updates, you might go into porting to a different console or different platform.
Ongoing development. Yeah.
Ongoing development, or you might go into another title. So this is sort of just the rough sort of timeline there, and the timelines that you kind of need to think about when you're looking at expenditure and funding. So this is also what a revenue model looks like. Generally speaking, in games, this is a bit of a typical model. So revenue will come in and will really spike as soon as you release. Now, the thing with games revenue is, unfortunately, once you make that sale, you're not getting that money for about a couple of months. So there's a bit of a lag behind that by the time it goes through, Apple or Steam or Humble, wherever you're releasing it. By the time it goes through their systems, it's usually about a 2-month delay to get into your account. So that's also something you need to account for when you're talking about revenue from the actual sale of the game. So the revenue will spike initially, and then it will drop off pretty quickly. Now, that depends. So we call this the tail after release, and it will drop off quite a bit, but how big or how fat that tail is how successful your title is and how long that funding can at least sustain you for or can run for. So there's a few things that kind of influence that, essentially. So early income does provide a strong indicator of income for the future. So if you have a really good release and you have a real big spike of income, essentially that will indicate that usually your tail will be a little bit fatter as it goes on. And we all want fat tails because that means a lot of money coming back to us. The best performers do have those fat tails because it's basically an ongoing revenue stream, essentially, or taking you into that next title. Staggered launches or staggered updates can also help with the revenue model post-release. So, sometimes you might run a promotional cycle or, release some new content into it, and that can also spike it again. So again, we're talking about the tail and we're talking about spiking the tail, which means it goes up again and then comes down again. And then, of course, the timing of the payments. So as I mentioned, sort of between 2 months, some of them are 1 month, but 1 to 2 months is sort of where you'll actually see the money in your bank account, essentially.
Yeah. And that revenue model, we're talking here about a more atypical release. Obviously, there are a host of different models out there, and your freemium and free-to-play type advertising-driven titles will have a slightly different release and income stream. So bringing it back to some of those earlier timeframes we're talking about, we'll have time for questions at the end if that's okay. Really, now we're going to talk about some of the sources of cash flow coming in that will assist in those various phases. Amy's obviously covered off, the easy piece, which is that the game is a great success and produces a huge amount of revenue, and everyone's really happy with that. But to get to that point, we actually need to fill in the gaps, which is why the cash flow and understanding what your outgoings are going to be in that early stage is quite critical. So some of the early sources of income that we see coming in this prototyping or planning phase is fairly limited. There are a number of the various screen authorities that provide sort of prototyping grants. They tend to be quite small in contribution. They're all state-based. They vary state by state. So it's worth being across and staying in contact with the body that is related to where you are domiciled. They're often focused around concept. I understand from the release, the Screen Australia announced an early stage grant as well, so that will complement this as well. That was announced last night. The other big one, and the one that we most commonly see, is sweat equity. So that is where the owners are essentially putting in the hours for no form of remuneration. Now that, in a way, that doesn't impact your budget because you're not putting any outgoings in, but we sort of see that as a way to sort of cross the gap. And then the various forms of early stage investment. Now that typically comes from family and friends or someone who's backing you in on a project, and that can be by way of a loan or maybe a stake in the company. They tend to be fairly small and not particularly common. All right. No. Okay, I think we've covered all those. So once we actually get into the meat of it, we're talking about the production piece. This is where the majority of your costs are going to start to be incurred. Again, there was the announcement last night by Screen Australia of expansion of their offerings. So as I understand it, there's $100,000 available on a project-by-project basis. And really this is targeted towards those studios that are sitting just outside of the Digitio framework. So this is really targeted at expenditure 500k and less, or development of 500k or less. Typically, those particular funds, you have to be very mindful of the time frame on them. So they'll often require a budget to be prepared and submitted. So very similar to what we had earlier, albeit I think they've got their own prescribed format that you need to follow. And then there's very set cut-off times in terms of when submissions are required. So you should monitor those. And I'd encourage everyone to speak to Screen Australia. They're really approachable, I've found in the past. And it's worth having a conversation about ensuring that you get your application to the standard they expect. And get an understanding of what it is that they're looking for. The various state screen authorities, again, have a number of development grants. So you again, there'll be deadlines there, there'll be budgets required. It's worth, again, availing yourself of the opportunity to speak to them. They're all here over the next couple of days. Feel free to reach out and book a meeting. I say that and I don't know how accepting they are of that, but I think you want to get in front of them and try and have the conversation as much as you can.
I think too, if we can recommend when you're on the websites, making sure you keep an eye on when the things open, applications open and close, because sometimes they are quite a short period of time. So you do need to make sure you're sort of monitoring that or signing up for the updates with your local government, because that's really important. You don't want to miss out on something just because, you know, you're a week late or didn't realise the funding had closed. So that's really important with the state ones, because they do unfortunately need to close and allocate their funds, and you want to be a part of that if you can.
And they're competitive as well. So there is a fixed allocation typically, so that means that the funding is not unlimited. Not everyone will be approved. So improving the quality of the submission really helps. Then we start to talk and transition more into the commercial agreements that we've seen out there. So we've broken them up here in really three sort of core agreements. What we regard as platform agreements, where we're dealing with some of the majors. And typically that's about sort of getting a signing allocated to their particular platform, so that they have the unique ability to commercialise the title. They'll tend to come probably later in the development cycle, is what we would say anecdotally. I know certainly in dealing with Apple in the past, they've tended to come in fairly early, but a lot of this, the platforms will be looking at a fairly polished product before they'll actually start having a conversation around a platform agreement. Typically, they're structured as a loan arrangement or some form of advance on sales, and then repayment will come by way of title sales down the track or share of profit down the track. Sometimes they are actually fixed allocations. That's typically when they're on, say, Game Pass or something like that. So you're essentially locking yourself in.
And it's really important, as Luke said, they usually come later in the development cycle when you've got like a prototype or some sort of product or demo to show. So it's important to plan that into your time. You know, do you want to take something to GDC and actually take a prototype there to show people, to get, you know, the contacts over there? And that's really important to be able to plan for that and make sure, you know, you're not missing that deadline, essentially. I know it's not a close of funding deadline, but it's important to be able to make use of those connections and make use of those networking events when you can as well.
The next will be publisher agreements. So they tend to come along at a sort of pre-production or production phase. They're often there because publishers will want to see an idea come off the ground and be able to touch and play with a prototype. Again, they will typically be in the form of some sort of loan or advance, and often a link to revenue with retentions there or recovery via profit share. Licensing and distribution agreements, they're a bit more of an unusual one. We're seeing more and more of them. They're typically linked to localisation or particular markets. So where a title may be successful, it might have a subsequent release in a different jurisdiction and may require some localisation there. And typically that's sort of handled by a third party. And oftentimes the revenue stream that's coming in at that stage will be by way of just a profit share out of the sales that are handled by this third party. They can be, of course, very similar in arrangement to the other earlier platform or publisher agreements, whereby it's more of a profit share type arrangement. This will typically come, we put it in as development here. You might see this actually come post release, because oftentimes it's taking an existing concept and then taking it out to a different market. And then finally, and largely this sort of covers all of the above in a way, but we are seeing a number of them signed individually, is what is essentially a royalty investment agreement, whereby someone's providing funding, an allocation of funds, to a company, making that contribution and then sharing in the sales down the track. They tend to be quite attractive, but you often need to be mindful of the fact that ultimately what you're doing is you're sacrificing revenue after release for revenue before release, and making sure you're striking the balance there is really important, because it will obviously impact the next stage if you've got another title following on. Now, we've glossed over a lot of the detail here. I'd really encourage people, if they're interested in understanding some of these more unique agreements, Jason Della Rocca has a number of talks there that you can find on the GDC Vault. So I definitely encourage you all to jump on and have a look at what he has to say on the space.
And just when you are looking at these agreements, we just want to make the point that no two agreements are the same. So always come and see an accountant or come and see a lawyer to make sure you know what you're signing up to. Make sure you know what the repayment schedule is like, how much interest or how much extra you are repaying on top of that, because that's really important. And sometimes we see people at a later date, they come to us after everything's been signed, and really there's nothing we can do but tell you exactly what the contract says and what your obligation is. So it's really important, because there are a lot of tax issues that can crop up, particularly with multinationals and particularly with jurisdictions overseas and with Australia. We're talking GST things, we're talking withholding taxes, we're talking about the definition of a royalty. These things are actually really important, and it's really important for us to be able to see the agreement and inform you guys as to how that's going to work. We obviously work with lawyers to do that, but we need to make sure that you are repaying things correctly from a tax perspective as well. So really
is that
important.
like a bonus slide we need for withholding tax?
Yeah, that's a whole
Has
nother...
everyone figured out what the withholding taxes are in a double tax agreement?
That's a whole nother 50-minute talk, I think.
Look, it's a good one to be aware of, and Amy's right, without sort of coming across as though we're selling our services, but it is important to get the right advice on it. And, to give you an example, we have had a client with a multi-million-dollar project that hadn't got advice on withholding tax and found their budget pinched by 15% because of withholding taxes. So you just want to be mindful of that and try and have those conversations as early as you can. So now we'll move on to the release stage. So this is one of those interesting ones. We've got it as a solid line on our time frame, but clearly there's a little bit before and a little bit after here that comes into play. Typically, once you've actually got a release, that's actually initiating the opportunity to have a conversation with investors and talk about people taking a stake in the company, and that grants the opportunity to bring some cash in a lump sum as an allocation of shares potentially. Sometimes it's more project-based and they might partner with you on a future project. So it's important to take that opportunity to leverage the outcomes of what you've produced into the next project. We have seen a little bit of crowdfunding over the years. It's kind of comes in cycles. I know it's definitely probably not the vogue now. I certainly haven't seen one in an Australian or client of ours use it recently. Probably 3-4 years ago, we were seeing a lot of clients use it, particularly as an opportunity for pre-sales and building a marketing case and maybe arguably building a Q&A team. So potentially a great opportunity there. But as I said, we're probably seeing less and less of it. Patreon seems to be one that's coming through, but very much at the very small scale side of things. Early access and pre-release sales. Steam are obviously very pro in pushing the early access release of titles. We've seen mixed results from that. I don't know that I've seen necessarily one success going either way. Well, I should say we've seen success both ways, but not necessarily an indicator of favouring a particular approach. And it certainly comes down to how confident you are that the title is at least going to be in a working format and not going to put your market off. And then finally, we come back to the various state screen bodies that are providing typically marketing grants. That's often where you're looking at getting your title out there to the various trade shows, as Amy touched on, getting across the GDC and some of the other trade shows that are there, and getting your product in front of these people that will be funding the future of it, or the future releases. And then finally, we transition into this post-release, which really, if you think about it, sort of should be crossing over into the prototyping and potentially development of the next title. So the main funding there we've touched on already is the sales, and the successful game will produce the revenue that will then provide funding into the next project. there's a whole other talk there around, how you make that work and what the right amount of success looks like, and how you actually come to success. I think a number of people will be talking about that over the next couple of days. We tend to focus more on the dollar side of things. So if that money is coming in, albeit a little bit delayed because the platforms hang on to it for a bit, that will then provide the funding for the future project. The big game changer in the space, of course, is the GGTO. We're not going to cover on that in a lot of detail today. There'll be a talk tomorrow. I'm on a workshop panel where we'll talk about it and do a deep dive, so it's worth coming along tomorrow if you have a chance. The GGTO will be a real game changer, I think. We're seeing a number of applications come through already, providing a straightforward rebate, particularly focused around employment costs. Now, the important thing to note here, and the timing is quite critical with this piece, is that the GGTO is lodged with your tax return, and it's lodged, depending on your certificate, either when a game's released, when a port's made, or potentially on the ongoing development. So you'll need to actually get a submission in with the Office of the Arts, get approval through the Office of the Arts, and then lodge it on your income tax return. That makes release dates really interesting, because if you do your initial public release sometime in July, then it's at the start of the financial year, and you won't be able to claim DGTO until you have gone through the full financial year, gone past 30 June, make your submission to the Office of the Arts, and then make your claim. You can do early submissions, of course, and that's typically encouraged, but even then you'll still be relying upon the lodgement of an income tax return to claim the offset. So cash flow doesn't come through straight away. I'm aware of a number of financiers out there probably circling a little bit in the space, and I'm not sure. I've seen one come through so far, maybe a few others will that I'm not aware of that have come to the table. It's very common in the film space, so we might see more of that picking up steam over time. And then, of course, there are a number of, depending on your state, a number of production rebates. Victoria has quite an attractive one. I believe Queensland and South Australia do as well, I'm aware of. Some of the other states have dropped off. I know New South Wales was planning on having one, then I believe that got cut at the last state budget. So you'll need to check where your company is registered, where the majority of your employees are located, and be aware of the opportunities to put an application in there, again, and the timeframes and the like. So look, that really wraps up our presentation, just slightly over half an hour. The aim of today was to create a bit of an opportunity for people to have questions or ask us anything. So we've got a roving mic ready to float around. Just for the purpose of the recording, if you wouldn't mind just waiting till the mic hits you. And I'll put our contact details up here as well if anyone has any questions or wants to ask us something later.
Hi, Ralph Milberg from Audacious. I was wondering, with all the accounting that you're doing, do you look at it from a cash accounting or an accrual accounting basis, particularly when you're looking at, things showing up but then the cash coming through later?
Really good question. I think it depends on the size of the studio. For a lot of smaller studios, really the cash approach and receipt basis is essentially the main way we look at it. Typically, once a studio starts to become larger, then looking at that pipeline and allowing for ongoing forecasting, seeing what's coming through in the next month and the month after, becomes really helpful, yeah.
And if you're doing sort of follow-up with that, with the accrual, we have investors in the studio and they really want to see accrual accounting. Whereas we're small, we do a cash accounting, it's much easier. It's a real pain. How do you find the kind of accrual accounting for things like App Store income and things like that? Seems a bit of a pain. And what are some great tools for that? Or tricks?
Look, it's a bit of a challenge with some of them. Look, they have gotten a lot better. I'll say 5 years ago, that was hard to get those reports from the platforms. It's a lot better now and it's a lot more timely now. So we are actually able to usually close off a month and get an accrual figure in there. Regardless of what your books are on, so obviously in your situation, other investors and people want to see accrual accounting. And that's okay. And your books can be on accrual purpose, but we still encourage you to check and maintain like a cash flow statement, because really that's what's going to get you sustainability and that's what's going to get you through. So regardless of your accounting method for your tax return or your books, we always recommend, look at the cash for a cash flow perspective, obviously.
Have some awareness.
Just have awareness of it, I
think a lot of the reason for the delay is often there's clawback and the like, so even then it can be a bit, speculative.
Yeah.
Next question.
What are the conditions where withholding? Are there conditions where withholding a tax is applied on the funding that you're actually receiving?
Withholding tax typically applies under, keeping this very, very short, very brief. So each tax jurisdiction has a different tax regime. The interaction between most tax jurisdictions is covered by what's called a double tax agreement. It's an agreement that's ratified in both countries. Under the taxation arrangements under each double tax agreement, they're all unique. They follow an OECD model by and large, but there's a lot of quirks there, particularly the US one's quite interesting. So they'll cover a range of different things. The main risk area that we see is on the taxation of royalties. And what I mean by that is where a company that's domiciled in a particular jurisdiction makes a payment to another jurisdiction that takes the form of a royalty, which might be, say, a percentage of sales, that can be regarded and captured as a taxable payment under withholding tax regime and mean that there's the onus on the payer, the person who's paying the money, to withhold a percentage of that and remit that to their local government on behalf of the person they're paying.
What was the situation where you had a 15% withholding? Was the payee an Australian company?
Yes, correct.
Oh, okay. And that came from the US as well?
That was EU.
Right.
Yeah,
cool.
It's probably worth noting that withholding works both ways, though. So it might be that you are the payer and you're the one withholding because you're paying overseas, or it might be the other way around. If they're collecting revenue, they might need to be withholding on your payment. So it works both ways, but it's just something to be aware of because the definition of a royalty is also very broad, and the definition with all of those DTAs is also very different depending on what country you're dealing with. So it's just having awareness of it, not so much understanding every little last bit about it, but having an awareness that might trigger something, that's all.
Hi, sorry, it's not so much a question but it's just a statement. Just wanted to clarify that the Screen New South Wales digital games development rebate is open. There was a temporary kind of pause, but it is back open.
It's
so I just wanted to clarify for everyone in the room.
That's great to hear, great to hear.
Do we have any other questions? Ben's got one up the front.
Yeah, just sort of like talking about all like the state funds and like you mentioned like where your company is registered, but then at the end you said or where all your employees are. So like we're all remote now. So how do I know where? Yeah. What funds am I apply for?
Yeah, it's really interesting because of the natural transition and I suppose disaggregation of the workforce and spreading across states is becoming more of an issue. It's really, as I understand it, it's where the employee is located, so where they're registered. So typically when we've looked at, I'll use South Australia as an example, as long as the employee's living in that particular state, then they'll typically be counted for the purpose of that particular rebate. And if they're maybe a South Australian company, so the company is registered to an office in South Australia, it will only be those staff that are employed there within the state that are eligible. Right. Yeah, typically. Yeah, I won't speak for every state because each one changes it, and as we've pointed out already, it's changed today. Yeah. One down the back.
And sorry, just some clarity kind of further on that question. So if you had employees that, say you're in a Sydney registered company for whatever, and you've got employees in Melbourne, so you can't apply for the Melbourne rebate for those employees because the company is not registered there?
That's my understanding. So it's typically both a combination of where your company is registered and then also where the employees are registered. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it's worth seeking guidance and clarity because each state will have different enacting legislation that will cover that off. So it's hard to sort of say with absolute certainty. It's very much a case of do your research. The state authorities have really great information because they're typically encouraging people to apply, so they want you to actually come to the table. So do your research. Yeah.
Hi, Luke Amy. I come from a film background and now moving into a games developmental industry. What would you say are probably the not obvious, like obviously doing research is like, 101 and you have to do it, but what would you say is probably the greatest pitfalls you've seen people moving from other industries into game development funding that maybe blindsided them, that you'd be like, watch out for this particular issue?
The withholding tax, definitely a stinger that we were referring to earlier. That's caught out even quite a seasoned player, I'd say. The key and the reason, the purpose of our chat today is really to talk about and encourage people to look at record keeping and the joys of accounting as something that you want to embrace early in the process. I know. And Amy's got some great tools there that will help ease the process. So it's not to become a burden, but really to try and approach it from the perspective of getting the right understanding of where you think the project's going to head, and know where your cash is going, where your cash outflow is going to be, and what you're going to need. Because the worst thing that will happen is you're planning for a release, and you get 80% of the way there, and your funding dries up, and you just have no way to complete. And that can be quite fatal, particularly for the DGTO, because if you don't have a release, you don't have access to that offset either. So.
I think it's really understanding that the games revenue is lumpy, whether it's from funding or from sales. It is lumpy, and understanding that you'll probably have an influx at a certain period of time of quite a significant amount of funds, but then also that's got to drive you potentially to your next title or to potentially to your next funding milestone or whatever it might be. So I think that one of the main pitfalls from different industries is the lumpiness of the revenue, and understanding that, which is why we like to discuss and I guess reiterate that cash flow is important, and cash flow from the bottom up is important to understand how long that revenue is going to last you and where it's going to come from.
This whole withholding tax thing now has me a bit terrified. So if I can ask a question. Let's say I'm an Aussie dev studio, we want to release on Steam, we end up getting a UK or US publisher, and then someone from Asia buys our product that was promoted by a US publisher, and we're an Aussie company. So, where are the tax? How does that work? Is the money can you talk me through that? What would be the red flags there? Because I'm not sure who is that money going to? Is it going to the publisher? And obviously there's revenue split. So let's just say it's 60-40. How does that work? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so I'll answer it in a summarised fashion. Typically your sales that are coming through, they're coming through via the Steam platform. So Steam's going to deal with a lot of that for you in terms of the local, the end consumer and how they're taxed. So the sales tax and then repatriation of money back into Steam is kind of dealt with in that aspect. Then typically the money's coming from Steam across to your accounts. That's why you'll complete, everyone would have done a W8 Ben form at some stage during their career, or
We'll come across one.
That's essentially the US government form to identify you and which jurisdiction you are in, and which clause under the double tax agreement you're relying upon to exempt the sales from Steam from being subject to withholding tax. So that money will then come across to you. If you have a royalty share arrangement with, say, a distributor or something along those lines, it's going to very much depend on the terms that are used and the jurisdiction that you are dealing with. So in a lot of cases, if it's simply a case of saying, hey, we're just going to pay you a share of 15% of whatever sales we make after Steam platform fees, typically we would see that as a royalty. And that would then place a burden on the developer who's paying that money offshore to then withhold a percentage from whatever that payment is and remit that to the ATO.
It's worth noting that the withholding comes off the gross payment that you're paying. So it's not in addition to, it's not like GST added on top of, it's coming out of.
It comes out of.
Yeah.
If it's coming back the other way, typically it would be a payer making a payment to you. You're expecting $100, you only receive $85. And that $15 is what we regard as a foreign tax credit. And we'll potentially be able to recover it and potentially not.
Sounds easy. Thanks.
All right, I think that probably wraps up all the questions that we've had. Look, thanks for your time today. I appreciate you coming down to see our presentation. Hopefully you got something out of it. If you do have any questions, feel free to come and say hello to Amy and myself, or we do have a booth just across the hall. We don't bite. Happy to field any and all questions.
Thanks, guys.